Okay, so let's unpack this. So we're diving into a topic that's really been making headlines, sparking, well, a lot of debate. That's the deployment and, the changing role of the National Guard, particularly in Washington, D.C. So, our mission today, using sources like implementation of the National Guard in Washington, D.C., is to really pull out the key insights. We want to understand the history, the context, and figure out if recent events signal, maybe, a fundamental shift in what the Guard is for, moving beyond its usual roles into something new and pretty contentious. And to really get a feel for this, you kind of have to picture this one specific, really striking event, August 11th, 2025. President Donald Trump deploys the National Guard in D.C., and this is crucial, he also takes control of the district's local police force. He does this using something called the Home Rule Act. Now, this act it's a really key piece of legislation because it essentially gives the president unique authority over D.C.'s local government, including the police, under certain circumstances. It allows for direct federal intervention, often controversially, I should add. So the trigger for all this, a violent carjacking incident involving a White House staffer, happened that same day, August 11th. President Trump then declared it Liberation Day. He announced plans to evict homeless individuals. And this, as you can imagine, immediately sparked intense controversy, fierce opposition from D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser. So yeah, this isn't just another deployment. It really raises some profound questions.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how quickly things can escalate and how these historical legal tools get adapted or maybe reapplied to new circumstances or what are presented as new circumstances. This specific deployment in D.C. in 2025 is not just a single moment. It feels like a really critical point in this much longer story, this narrative of the National Guard's role in the Capitol. And like you said, the immediate controversy, the pushback, it signals that something might be changing. We really need to look back before we can understand what's happening now and looking forward. The core question is this just, business as usual under existing authority? Or is it a significant shift, a real change in how the Guard is perceived and used domestically?
That really is the core question, yeah. Because to understand why that August 2025 event feels so different, so noteworthy, we need to rewind a bit. Look at the DC National Guard's history. It actually has pretty deep roots. It goes all the way back to President Thomas Jefferson. He formed it mainly to, well, secure the Capitol during tense times. And since then, it's been activated countless times. The Civil War, various protests, moments of civil unrest. Historically, these activations have largely been about supporting civil authorities during big emergencies or protecting federal property.
Exactly. And if you look at that broader historical picture, these large deployments, they often happen during moments of, let's say, significant national crisis or major public disorder, situations where local authorities just need substantial backup. Take 1968, for instance. After the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, the D.C. National Guard was part of this huge force, over 13,000 soldiers. I mean, that's an enormous number. And their mission was very clear. Restore order. There was widespread rioting, significant damage, particularly in neighborhoods like Shaw. It was a clear, large-scale response because the situation had overwhelmed local police.
Right. And we've seen similar kinds of activations much more recently, too, which sort of reinforces that traditional role. Think about June 2020. During the George Floyd protests, the entire D.C. National Guard, that's about 1,300 troops, was activated then. And they were actually joined by another 3,900 Guard members from other states. Again, the mission was primarily about restoring order, enforcing curfews, securing federal buildings and property. We worked alongside federal law enforcement agencies. It was a big, coordinated effort responding to widespread unrest.
Precisely. And maybe the most vivid one in recent memory for many people is January 6, 2021. After the Capitol riot, you had more than 25,000 Guard members deployed. That was initially right after the riot, and then continuing through President Joe Biden's inauguration for security. And about 2,000 of those troops actually stayed on duty until late May 2021. Their job was maintaining security, assisting law enforcement at key government buildings. So what all these instances have in common, right, from 68 right through to 2021, is the Guard operating on a large scale, typically in response to national-level emergencies, serious civil disorder that's become widespread, or to protect critical federal infrastructure. They come in when the situation has really escalated beyond local capacity or requires a very specific, robust security presence.
Okay, so that history paints a pretty clear picture of the Guard's more traditional deployments. Large scale, clear emergency, or widespread unrest. Now let's bring it back to those 2025 events, because they really seem to introduce a new chapter, a potentially, well, troubling one. Let's revisit that August 2025 deployment we started with. Again, President Donald Trump uses the Home Rule Act, takes control of D.C. police, deploys the National Guard. And the stated reason, remember, was that single violent carjacking incident involving a White House staffer.
Right. And that immediately raises questions, doesn't it, about the scale of the response versus the scale of this supposed threat. So on August 12, 2025, the day after, about 800 D.C. National Guard troops were mobilized, federal authority. But it's important to note, sources say only about 100 to 200 were actually on duty at any one time. And what were they doing? Primarily administrative tasks, logistics, support duties, not direct policing on the streets. Crucially, they had limited law enforcement powers. They remained largely unarmed when serving in public roles. They were working alongside federal law enforcement, who presumably did have those powers. So while a fair number were mobilized, their direct role wasn't arresting people or fighting crime in the traditional sense, even though the trigger was a single crime.
Okay, but then it didn't stop with just the DC Guard, right?
Yeah.
This wasn't just a local DC thing. In mid-August 2025, something else happened. Republican governors from several other states started sending their National Guard troops to DC. We're talking about Louisiana sending 135 members, Mississippi sending 200, Tennessee planned for 160, West Virginia deployed 300 to 400, South Carolina approved 200, Ohio sent 150. So by August 19th, you had about 1,100 Guard troops from 6 different states confirmed for deployment in D.C., all federally funded, initiated by the Trump administration. That scale, bringing in troops from multiple states, that really broadens the picture here.
Exactly. And it wasn't just happening in D.C. either. We see a similar pattern emerging elsewhere around the same time. For instance, back in early June 2025, President Trump ordered 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles. This was during immigration protests there. That deployment was later expanded, adding 700 U.S. Marines on June 9th. Now, the protests reports say there was some property damage, some confrontations, but local officials described them as largely manageable. And this move in L.A. generated significant opposition, really strong pushback from California's governor, who actually mounted legal challenges, arguing it was federal overreach, unnecessary interference in state matters. So we're not just looking at D.C. in isolation. It seems to be part of a broader strategy, using these presidential powers, often meeting resistance from state leaders.
Right, so this is clearly getting complex. You've got federal intervention in what many see as local policing or protest management, a pretty rapid increase in using the Guard for these situations. So what does this all mean legally? How is the Guard activated? There must be specific legal authorities that govern this, and understanding those seems crucial to grasping the whole controversy.
Absolutely. And the distinction is vital here. The National Guard operates under two main legal authorities. First, there's Title 32 authority. That's when the Guard operates under state control. Think governor activating the Guard for a flood or a state emergency. Even if the mission gets federal funding, the command stays with the state. Then there's Title 10 authority. This is when the Guard is federalized. Under Title 10, they are deployed under direct presidential authority. They essentially become part of the federal military forces for that specific mission. And the president is empowered to federalize Guard units under Title 10 for certain emergencies, or, crucially, for public order situations. Now, what's fascinating and really critical for D.C. is that the D.C. National Guard is unique. It reports directly to the president, who acts as its commander-in-chief because D.C. isn't a state. This structure streamlines federal activation compared to state Guard units, where a governor might object or delay.
Okay, so DC's unique status makes it kind of easier ground for a president to deploy a Guard directly. But then the question becomes, what exactly counts as an emergency or a public order situation that justifies federalizing troops, especially bringing them in from other states and doing it when there's significant pushback from, say, the mayor?
Precisely, and that is the absolute crux of the legal and political fight here. While the president has the authority under Title 10, the central argument, the real contention, highlighted by these 2025 deployments in both D.C. and Los Angeles, is that using the Guard primarily for crime control, responding to things like a single carjacking or managing protests that local police might handle, rather than those traditional large-scale emergencies, widespread civil disorder, or disaster response. That marks a significant shift in its intended function. And this drew immediate sharp criticism from legal experts, from local officials, not just because it felt like an overreach, but because it starts to blur those historically important lines between the military and domestic policing.
So it's not just that the Guard was deployed, but the reason why and how. You're saying the why is critical because historically there's been a deliberate effort to keep military forces separate from everyday law enforcement. Is that right? To protect civil liberties, prevents the sort of militarization of local issues.
Exactly that. You have laws like the Posse Comitatus Act, which generally prohibits using the U.S. military, the Army, the Air Force, for domestic law enforcement. Now, the National Guard has some exceptions, particularly when operating under state authority, Title 32, or during certain federally declared emergencies or insurrections, invoking Title 10. But these 2025 deployments really set off alarm bells for critics. They saw it as potential mission creep, where the Guards' role expands beyond its traditional mandate disaster relief, major civil unrest into areas normally handled by civilian police. And this leads to concerns. Concerns about federal overreach, definitely. About the erosion of local control over policing, and even concerns about using military training, tactics, and potentially equipment in ways that might not be appropriate for dealing with civilian populations domestically. Mayor Bowser's strong opposition in D.C., it was rooted right there in that concern about federal intrusion into local governance and local policing.
It really sounds like these events are forcing a conversation, maybe even a confrontation, about how we define public order in a domestic setting and just how far presidential authority extends when using the Guard for what some might see as essentially domestic policy enforcement rather than clear-cut national emergencies.
That's a very perceptive way to frame it.
Yes.
And the resistance from state governors, like we saw in California, complicates it even further. It highlights that delicate balance of federalism, that division of power between the federal government and the states. When governors object to having their Guard units federalized and sent elsewhere, especially for missions they disagree with, it points to a deeper tension. A tension about who ultimately controls these forces and for what purpose they can be used inside the U.S. It feels like a reevaluation of the Guard's very identity. Is it a force of last resort for extreme crises? Or is it becoming a more readily available tool for a broader range of domestic issues, maybe even issues traditionally handled locally?
So we've traced this arc from the D.C. National Guard's origins with Jefferson, focusing on securing the Capitol, through its role in major civil unrest like the '68 riots, the 2020 protests, and now landing on these recent, highly controversial deployments in 2025, both in D.C. and, as you pointed out, in Los Angeles. And the key takeaway, the thread that seems to connect this recent shift, is moving from responding to widespread emergencies or disasters to deployments explicitly justified by crime control, even single incidents, often triggering significant opposition from local and state leaders in the process.
Right. And if we step back and look at that bigger picture, the real question left for us to think about is this. As the nature of crises evolves, or perhaps as political directives change, how do these shifts in deployment, especially when they involve federalizing units for things like crime control, and then facing legal pushback from governors, how does that redefine the balance of power, within our whole federal system? And does it fundamentally alter the definition, the very purpose of what the National Guard is intended to do in America? It's definitely something for you, the listener, to consider. What are the long-term implications of using military assets more frequently in domestic policy? And how will this ongoing tension, this tug of war between federal and state authorities, shape the future of these really vital forces?